It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Former Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy is outraged by Donald Trump, his pardoning of the January 6th rioters at the Capitol, and by most of his recommended cabinet appointees. In a wide-ranging interview at his office at the University of Vermont, Leahy said Trump has made, quote, one misstatement after another, and is acting in his own self-interest, not the country's. The 84-year-old Leahy, who stepped aside 2 years ago after 8 terms, is glad to be back home. In part one of our interview, he critiqued Trump, labeled Congress dysfunctional, and said the Supreme Court is no longer impartial. We're living in Orwellian fiction, he said. Leahy also reflected on some of his accomplishments, including a ban on landmines and voting to end the war in Vietnam. I felt I'd done my duty, he said. Our discussion begins after a word from our sponsor, Red Hen Baking Company. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Do you miss being in Washington?
No.
Oh, come on, a little bit.
I miss some of my friends, but it's not the Senate I knew. I went down for President Carter's funeral, Marcel and I did, and went down for the Kennedy Center honors because our friends from the Grateful Dead were being honored. And I'll walk around the Capitol and see senators I enjoyed serving with. But no, I do not miss it. When I decided to retire, and actually decided years before my term was up, I knew I could have been reelected easily, but we wanted to come home. And we sold the place we had in the Washington area and moved back fully to Vermont. We'd always had our farmhouse in Vermont. And the Senate and the Congress are not the place I knew when I came there. And it's, well, I'll give you one example. The latest president, has pardoned the people who murdered police officers at the Capitol when they were there in the riot and the demonstration that he had promoted. I was in the building at that time. I saw the damage being done. We heard the people crashing through. And I started my public career in law enforcement. And to see police officers who were trying to defend the Capitol, sworn to defend the Capitol, who were killed, some badly injured, others died as a result of the mob that was ransacking the castle, or the Capitol. And here's President Trump pardons them all. I mean, what disrespect to law enforcement, what disrespect to our way of law, but that seems to be the way things are going now. And so the question, I'm happy to be back home. You know, I think of people I've known during Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, all of whom worked hard for the country. Civil service is based on merit. Now they want to replace the people who are there based on merit with cronyism. And people who have no idea what they're doing, but they're going to be appointed to that because we're going to make America great again. Well, it's going to diminish America terribly. I did not know any president, and I was there from the time of President Ford and until President Biden. Every one of those presidents, Republican or Democratic, wanted to do what was best for our country. And now we have a president who only wants to do what's best for him. He's already started selling things, mementos of him being there, so he and his family make more money.
Talk about some of the picks he's had. Are there any of these nominees that you could have voted for? I'm thinking of Hegseth at Defense, Bobby Kennedy Jr. at Health and Human Services, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. Any of those?
I would have voted for Marco Rubio because I know him well. We disagree very much on Cuba. His family's from Cuba. He wants us to restrict access to Cuba. I think it would be far better in our interest and Cuba's interest if we opened access to it. But I've worked with him on a lot of foreign policy things. He was a supporter of the Leahy War Victims Fund. He was a supporter of the Leahy landmine ban, and I would have voted for him. The man who's been nominated for Secretary of Defense, one of the most important positions in our government, has no qualifications for that. Even if he stayed sober enough, long enough to take the oath of office, he shouldn't be there. It hurt the country. Some of the others, I'm interested in hearing what the hearings say, but they're not people that I would expect from either a Republican or a Democratic administration. I voted for a lot of Republican nominations and a lot of Democratic nominations, but I voted against people I thought were not qualified. For example, a colleague of mine was nominated for Secretary of Defense, John Tower of Texas.
Yep.
We voted him down. I knew him. I was friendly with him, but he wasn't qualified, and he had personal problems. And so then they came up with another nominee.
What about Bobby Kennedy Jr.?
Bobby Kennedy Jr., I've known him for decades. He's not at all qualified. I think of those who worry that polio might come back because we're not being vaccinated. When I was a child, I was vaccinated. When our kids were children, they were vaccinated, and you took it for granted. And polio went away in this country. He have his way, polio will come back here and other parts of the world. He's come up with some of these cockamamie ideas, and that is not who should be head of Health and Human Services. He's eminently unqualified for that. And you notice that members of his own family say so.
Be interesting to see how Mitch McConnell votes, the last member of Congress who's actually had polio in an iron lung for a while. Be interesting to see how he votes.
I suspect he's going to vote against him. I've talked over the years with Senator McConnell. He believes very, very strongly of having people vaccinated. When we've had money in the appropriations bill to help with vaccination at all levels in our country, he's always supported that. And he says, he's told me very frankly, he feels lucky he's able to walk.
Why do you think Trump won?
I don't know. I think that he said, well, we got to bring the economy back. Well, actually, the economy had gone and improved considerably since he was president. He said, we've got to make America great again. He was the one who had downgraded NATO. Joe Biden brought NATO together for the first time in decades. In fact, even added 2 countries to NATO. He said that Putin's a genius. When he went into Ukraine, we had Republicans and Democrats who said we had to defend Ukraine. Why all that appealed to people, I don't know. The constant misstatements he made throughout his campaign just kept getting repeated and repeated, and he won. Kamala Harris would have been far better as president. She actually knew what was going on in the country. I served with her on different committees. I saw the way she would come prepared for things. Donald Trump actually makes up things. He wants an executive order to do away with citizenship for people born here. Well, that's in the Constitution. You can't write an executive order to do away with the Constitution. He says, but we're the only country that does that. Well, actually, 30 countries do it. And it would just make one misstatement after another. And unfortunately, people believed it.
Did Democratic leaders wait too long to encourage Joe Biden to drop out of the race? Is that part of the problem too?
I'd already left the Senate. Retired Joe Biden's a friend of mine. And I look at a number of things he's done that have been very, very helpful to our country, very, very helpful to our relationships with the rest of the world, the things that actually kept us as the most powerful country in the world, stood up to Russia. He does not call Putin a genius the way Trump did. And that had to be a decision he made. Had he run again, I would have supported him. I supported Kamala Harris. She would have made a very good president. And it would have been good to have the United States, one of the few major countries that hasn't had a woman as the head of it. But I looked at the racism that was used against her as it had been against Barack Obama, and I'm afraid some fell for that.
You weren't in the Senate at the time, but still, I would imagine that Joe Biden, given your long-standing relationship with him, would have listened to your advice. Did he wait too long?
He and I have discussed it, and that's a private conversation. I'll let him talk about it.
You say that you wanted to get out. You got out of the Senate when you were at the top of your game. Tell me more about what you meant by that.
Well, I remember when Bob Byrd had been majority leader for years, and he gave that up to be president pro tem and chair of the Appropriations Committee. And I thought to myself at the time, why would somebody do that? Then I became president pro tem and chair of Appropriations. I said, oh, now I understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave me an ability to do more things certainly for the state of Vermont, than had ever been done before by anybody in our Congress or our Senate. But also to do things worldwide that I wanted to do. The ban on landmines, the Leahy War Victims Fund, the number of people who have been helped with that, improving our relationship with Vietnam, where I've gone many, many times, something that I began doing back at the time of George H.W. Bush. And there were so many things I wanted to do. I wanted to get a farm to school program. I wanted to expand our school lunch, our feeding programs. I was able to do all of that. And a number of environmental things in this country I wanted to do. I was able to do it. But both Marcel and I just miss home so much. I felt I'd done my duty. I'm proud of being in the Senate. I never thought, there are two headlines I have framed from at that time, major newspaper. One 5 days before the election says, poll dooms Leahy. 5 days later, Leahy unexpectedly wins. And I went down there thinking I may only be here one term, but let me do what I think best. I became the only Vermonter to vote to end the war in Vietnam. The vote to end it carried by a 1-vote margin. It probably would have ended, but it ended sooner. And I thought at that time, if I'm here one term, okay. Far more than ever would have expected. The youngest person to be elected, the only Democrat, and all the rest. I never expected to be there 8 terms. I never expected to have the chairmanships and positions of leadership I had. But I embraced them and did what I could do, not only in the country, but Vermont and around the world. But I turned 80, and I said, it's time to leave. It's time to come home. Marcel and I have been married for over 60 years. We want to have time for our children and our grandchildren. We want to have time for ourselves. And I'm thankful for the University of Vermont giving me a nice library and an office and taking care of my archives. But I can come and go when I feel like it. And now when I watch what's happening, when I watch the House of Representatives disintegrate, I've watched the Senate not being an independent body, but feel they must do what the current president tells them to. I don't want to be there.
What's the adjustment like going from being one of the most influential people in Washington to, here you are, you're a private citizen here in Vermont?
I love it. I actually love it.
But come on. I mean, you were in this incredibly powerful position. That's got to be an adjustment.
And I am thankful I had that position. I'm thankful the people of Vermont that gave me that position. I know my parents would have been proud to see where I went. But Marcel and I, the most important thing in my life has been our marriage and our friendships and our children and grandchildren. And now we have time for that. Now there is one difference. I have to look for parking spaces now. I don't have that huge detail of armed guys that security, and they were wonderful. And Marcel and I said, isn't it nice we can be in the car and talk to each other?
Looking for quarters on the floor, or you got to download some app now wherever you go to park.
Yeah, well, we do all right. The thing is, we know Vermont. We're both born here. We're raised here. We go through the grocery stores or go down the street. We constantly run into people we've known for decades, and it's home. I find impressive pictures of the Capitol. I love being on the board of the Smithsonian. I enjoyed walking through the Capitol, feeling the sense of history. And it's also why I'm furious that the people who stormed the Capitol at Donald Trump's urging, they're destroying priceless parts of the Capitol, bringing about the death of police officers, to have them called heroes and to be excused and pardoned. It's not the country I came to. I was lucky when I came to the Senate. I was the only Democrat ever elected from Vermont. Certainly the youngest since the direct election. I was 34. You know who took me under his wing and helped me? Bob Stafford, who became a senior senator. He was Mr. Republican. He'd been in the military during World War II in Korea. He had been Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor, Congressman, and Senator. He was the epitome of Republican. He took me under his wing. and taught me much of what I learned about the Senate, and we worked together. But he also taught me something that's been forgotten. Work across the aisle. Bring Republicans and Democrats together. There was a study done once that I passed more bipartisan legislation than any senator in history. But you work at it. But at that time, you had senators in both parties who wanted to work together. Now there's far less of that. The Senate's not in session anywhere near enough. They don't have real debates. People look for sound bites on the news. The advantage I had as I became more and more senior, I would have rooms in the Capitol that were great places to have private meetings. I would have both Republicans and Democrats come to those, and we would work things out.
I went to a recent talk you had about your first election, and that was one of the things that you talked quite a bit about, that just the loss of bipartisanship, the loss of really camaraderie between Republicans and Democrats. Is that just gone? I mean, how do you get it back?
I don't know how we get it back. I've shown you a picture of the last major bill I passed. It covered all the spending for the coming year. They said it couldn't be done. Well, the senior Republican, Dick Shelby, a conservative Republican, we worked together. We trusted each other. We kept our word to each other. And worked weekends and nights, and we put together and got key Republicans, key Democrats to join us in passing it. I don't see any of that being done anymore. People seem to forget that that could be done. You look at people who say they justify the pardoning of people who endangered and even brought about the deaths of police officers at the Capitol. People were sworn to protect all people who work there, no matter what party they belong to. I really worry about that. I sometimes will, I read the news every day. I go online, read the Washington press and national press. I watch it, and I think, how can this be? If I had seen some of these things 10 years ago, I would have said that's some Orwellian fiction. That's not America. And I worry for the country.
But so what has happened? I mean, I think we are living in unprecedented times. Have we changed? Is it the media? What is it?
That's a good question. I wish there were more people who, when they're elected to these offices, would say, okay, my first duty is the people elected me into our country. Some of them seem to feel their first duty is to go out and get a soundbite on TV or on a podcast or whatever.
Social media.
And they think, what can I do to get myself reelected? What they should be doing is, what do I do to make the country better? And in the Senate, there's only 100 of us for well over 300 million people. And I think we have a responsibility, not to ourselves, but to the country. Right now, we have too many who feel their responsibility is only to themselves or to some special interest. And that's wrong. I don't care whether it's on the left or the right. If you're not willing to put the country first, then it's going to fail. And I worry for the Senate. I used to say when I got there, I felt the Senate, even with its imperfections, we saw that during segregation and so on, but I felt the Senate should be the conscience of the nation. And it was developing that way. It certainly isn't today.
When Trump was elected in 2016, the Senate and the House were also Republican. How did you and the Democratic leadership navigate that? What lessons could you pass on from that 4 years when you were there?
Of course, the House turned Democratic. Remember Nancy Pelosi's reaction to President Trump's State of the Union message. But there were still people in both bodies, in both parties, who wanted to work together. I'll give you an example. Even before Trump, I wanted to pass legislation to ban the sale of landmines from countries. I was told it couldn't happen. We had a bipartisan vote in the Senate. All 100 senators voted to ban the export of landmines. A Republican-controlled House sat down with me and some of the others who worked with me, and they passed the same thing. And then Italy passed it, and other countries passed it. And that legislation has saved thousands of lives. But it took bipartisanship. I wanted to do a war victims fund in Vietnam. The war had ended, and we were slowly building alliances. Some in the government were opposed to that. George H.W. Bush agreed with me, and we did it. And it saved thousands of lives, and it's improved our standing around the world. But it took Republicans and Democrats working together. And a lot of it's done quietly. You work together and give credit to each other, not just to yourselves.
So what should this Senate do now? How are they going to recreate that?
Well, I would hope that the leaders would do what I've seen other leaders do. When George Mitchell was a Democratic leader, Bob Dole was a Republican leader, they'd meet at least a couple times a day. They'd go back and forth to each other's office and just quietly work things out. Howard Baker did the same thing. We got to go back to doing that. I think the new leadership in the Republican Senate, I know them all, they have the potential to do it. But they've got to remember the Senate is an independent body. It is not under the president. We're independent under our Constitution. You've got the Congress, the judiciary, and the executive. 3 independent branches. That's what our founders wanted because it preserves democracy. And if you give up that independence, you give up a significant part of democracy.
Do you feel that today the Supreme Court is an independent third branch of government?
I'm afraid the Supreme Court has become less independent. And that bothers me because it used to be everybody look at the Supreme Court and say, okay, no matter what else is happening everywhere else, we can rely on the court. The public opinion polls show that everything. Look how the court has dropped in its respect in this country. And I voted on so many Supreme Court nominees, both Republicans and Democrats, voted for many. Well, the first one I voted for was nominated by Gerald Ford, and I voted to confirm him. He turned out to be extremely good person. But now you have people who want to make it political, and that is wrong. And it's going to hurt the country. The Supreme Court has got to show more independence.
Has the country gone over a cliff?
The country's hanging on the edge of the cliff. And that is not what I saw of our country when I got elected to the Senate. I saw us embroiled in a war in Vietnam. Just a few months after I got in the Senate, I was temporarily on Armed Services Committee. They had to vote to reauthorize the war. Had the President, Secretary of State Kissinger, and others lobbying me to vote for it, and they were telling me, No Vermont senator has ever voted to end the war in Vietnam. And if you vote that way, you'd be the first one. I voted that way 5 times in a row. Each vote to end the war won by a 1-vote margin. And the war ended. Now, I was told I'd never be reelected if I did that. I felt, well, I've got a duty to be here. I picked what I thought was the right thing to do. I did the same thing when I was a prosecutor. I prosecuted Democrats and Republicans, everybody else, if they committed a crime. And you do what you should do. I keep repeating, there's only 100 senators. And you have a 6-year term. Forget kowtowing to any special interest group or no matter what. Do what's best for the country. And the Senate's drifting away from that. The House certainly drifted away from it. Look at all the multiple elections in a matter of months for Speaker of the House. We've never seen anything like that. And potentially, the one place where the conscience of the nation might exist would be in the Senate. I'm hoping there are senators there that will do it. But I'm frustrated by the comments, especially some of the new senators.
You know, people talk about, and I've even used this term just here talking with you, that these are unprecedented times. Is that true? Is that hyperbole? Is there any period of time that you remember in your 8 terms down there that is comparable to this?
I can't think of any time comparable to this, but the Congress has gone through some difficult times. Look at segregation. I mean, that embroiled the country for years, but got past it. Look at the civil rights movement. How do you treat all Americans alike? That took work, but the Senate finally prevailed. And
Lyndon Johnson,
a Southerner from a state that endorsed segregation and everything else, comes in and knowing it might end any chance he had for re-election, ended it. I mean, his civil rights speech to the Congress, the joint session, is worth listening. I don't know if we're going to hear anybody give a speech like that today. We need to. Instead, we're having, instead of merit-based service, we're based on cronyism. And that is wrong. We're too great a country for that. And, we're going to annex Greenland. We're going to change the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. We're going to take back the Panama Canal. Oh, baloney. Let's start talking about how do we help people who are in poverty get out of poverty? How are we going to make sure that our children, the next generation, are well educated? How do we make sure that our country is secure and we have jobs for them? How do we show the welcoming nation that it was when my grandparents emigrated to Vermont from Italy, or my great-great-grandparents emigrated to Vermont from Ireland? They came to a place that welcomed them, and they succeeded. We've got to come back to that.
But how do you stop what seems to be a steamroll?
I wish I knew the answer. It's not going to stop until the Congress stands up to them, and hopefully the Supreme Court will stop a trend toward partisanship. Now, I voted to confirm, I was one of the few Democrats that voted to confirm John Roberts as Chief Justice. I know him as a good man, an honest man. I'm afraid that he's allowed too many others, especially people who had no reason to be there, like Kavanaugh, to shift the Supreme Court. I look at one of their cases giving immunity for things that Trump did. I look at Sonia Sotomayor's dissent in it, the most powerful dissent I've read of the hundreds and hundreds of cases in the Supreme Court. We've got to get back to that. I think one place where the best of America and the conscience of America can be shown is in the Supreme Court, if it will. The next place is in the Senate, if it will. I hope it will. I hope for the sake of my children and my grandchildren, it will. But especially for the sake of our country.
But I haven't heard you say anything. I haven't seen anything in this short period of time that would give any indication that that's going to happen. Have you?
No, I haven't. And that is what's so discouraging. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and say, where the heck are we going? Sometimes my language is a little bit stronger than that. And I worry. I worry for our children and our grandchildren. I worry for everybody, Republican and Democratic alike. I worry for the cohesion we should have in the country instead of the strong division we have in the country.
And we have what appears to be an oligarchy, income inequality. There is a picture from the inauguration with Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg all right there together. What was your reaction when you saw that photo?
I found it frightening. I mean, I thought back to the history of the robber barons and people like that. I found it frightening that they would suddenly be there. I know the reaction of writers in the Washington Post when Bezos stopped them having an editorial endorsing the president. I do applaud the New York Times, which said, "We'll be independent. We will never bend our knee." I believe in a free press. My parents even had a weekly newspaper in Waterbury called the Waterbury Record back before I was born. Now, they did show one bit of editorial control. One year, its weekly was coming out on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. And my proud Irish father had the paper printed in green. I'll accept that kind of control.
You mentioned, in a sense, anticipated my question. I was wondering, you study history, right?
Yep.
And you mentioned the robber baron era. Can you compare this era to any other time?
No, I can't think of a time where the checks and balances they're built into from the founders, from Madison, Washington, Jefferson, all the others. The checks and balances were built into our system. I've seen it being pushed now, and that we saw it in the Civil War when states left the United States. But I've never seen it being attacked like it is now. And if we don't bring back that independent branches of government, I wonder what this country is going to look like in a generation. It's the countries that show independence are the ones that flourish. Those that cave in to totalitarianism of any sort, they don't make it. I know Donald Trump calls Putin a genius, but look at the danger he's made to Russia. The thousands upon thousands who have died in a needless war. The inflation, the other problems in Russia. We don't need that. We don't need oligarchs. but we face the potential of oligarchs, not just Trump, but future ones, if we don't have an independent Congress. People should read history, read the debates of the founding fathers of this country in putting together independent branches of government. It had never been done anywhere in the world to the extent that we did. And that's why we stayed a powerful democracy. I would hate to see that just suddenly disappear.
People seem to be only looking out for their own self-interest, though.
Well, we saw that with the oligarchs that were lined up, given prominent display. I mean, the New Yorker magazine had on their cover showing the hand of one of those oligarchs,
Elon Musk,
on
yeah,
the Bible.
On the Bible, yeah.
Sort of overshadowing Trump. Well, I want an independent president. I might not agree with some presidents and some of their philosophies, but I respect their independence. When Trump is willing to pardon people who brought about the death of police at the Capitol, who stormed the Capitol, who created all kinds of damage, who had a gallows out there with Mike Pence's name on it, then I worry about where the country's going.
Did you have any problem with the pardons that Biden issued? I mean, including almost preemptive pardons, people like Liz Cheney, Fauci. I mean, he had thousands of pardons that he did, including some that prosecutors here in Vermont weren't even aware of until it happened. Some pretty bad apples.
No, I think prosecutors should have been notified on them. I always worry about pardons. I mean, I was a prosecutor for 8 years. I prosecuted murderers, embezzlers, and others. I was proud of my prosecution, but I knew that if a governor wanted to pardon them, they had the right to do it. I had the right to bring the charges. When I hear the rhetoric coming out of Trump wanting to prosecute Liz Cheney, saying that Mark Milley, one of the best chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff we've ever had, because he disagreed with, wouldn't carry out illegal orders from Trump. Trump said he should be put before a firing squad. I think if I was president, I'd be inclined to give them a preemptive pardon. I am worried, though, if we get into a thing where presidents of either party can start looking at preemptive pardons, we do have a problem. I've seen pardons over the years for Republicans and Democrats. Some I agreed with, some I didn't. But I've never seen them at this scale.
You said when you announced that you were leaving office that you wanted to leave at the top of your game. You'd accomplished everything you wanted to accomplish, and then you said almost. What was the almost?
The almost was, I was worried about the trends that were coming, and I hadn't known or found any way that I could stop them. And maybe in a democracy, it's just as well a senator wouldn't have the ability to stop them, but that was my almost. But I look at the thousands of things I'm proud of. I mean, I think of helping to bring the U.S. and Vietnam back together, helping landmine victims, both Americans and Vietnamese. The Leahy War Victims Fund is used around the world. It's brought people back. The Leahy Law, which has been enforced with one unfortunate exception around the world, has saved thousands and thousands of lives. And I'm happy about the things I was able to do here in the U.S. I've helped our technology industry and all because I wrote the first overhaul of our patent laws in 50 years. And certainly the nutrition bills I've passed, I'm proud of that. I never thought when I came in the Senate as the junior most member of the Senate that I'd be able to accomplish these things. And I'm very proud of what I've accomplished. Did I get everything I wanted? No. But I got so much more than I ever thought I would. I'm glad to see the reaction of people in Vermont now that we're back. But I also want to have time with Marcel. I want to have time with our children and our grandchildren. And that's, to me, is the best part of life.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Be sure to check out part 2 of my interview with former Senator Patrick Leahy, where he talks about his wife Marcel and his plans for the future. Thanks for listening.